Warhammer Fantasy, the tabletop wargame created by Games Workshop in 1983. Imagine Lord of the Rings, but everyone's miserable, Gandalf's dead in a ditch, and your friendly neighborhood sewer rat just weaponized chemical warfare. Players build armies, or dream of affording them, solemnly swear they'll paint their miniatures next weekend, and then watch a single bad dice roll turn their tactical masterpiece into a goblin buffet. The world? Vast and packed with humans, elves, dwarfs, vampires, mummies with god complexes, furries, football hooligans, rats on meth, and Americans, each with their own absurd playstyle and lore. There are no shining heroes here, just increasingly desperate people trying to dodge the apocalypse, and failing miserably. Villains? Oh, they've got villains. From literal chaos gods to the biggest prick of a necromancer, looking at you, Nagash, and steroid-abusing rats with genuine nuclear bombs. Warhammer Fantasy spawned an avalanche of novels, video games, and eventually Age of Sigmar, Games Workshop's bold decision to nuke the setting because it just wasn't selling well. But for now, we're sticking with the classic, Warhammer Fantasy Battles, a world of grim absurdity, bonkers lore, and fun characters, and maybe just a sliver of hope. If most fantasy settings feel like idealized medieval societies where you'd want to live, Warhammer Fantasy feels like an ongoing punishment for the crime of existing. Every kingdom teeters on the edge of collapse. Magic is a death wish masquerading as a useful tool, and no matter who you are, the world hates you. Want to be a noble? Congratulations. You'll either be assassinated, corrupted by chaos, or executed by a particularly twitchy witch hunter. A commoner? Get ready to be taxed into the grave, assuming the plague doesn't get to you first. A wizard? Let's hope your spell doesn't turn you into a puddle or delete you from existence. Magic in Warhammer Fantasy isn't your standard, well-regulated system where wizards study in peace and learn cute spells like Expelliarmus. No. Here it is a volatile, barely understood force that can and will go horribly wrong. One day, your fireball spell works as intended. Another day it fizzles out. Another day you explode, or you accidentally summon a greater demon of corn that would like to discuss your life's extended warranty. Magic is less academic discipline, and more chaotic gambling addiction with a 50% chance of self-immolation. So if you're expecting a nice, orderly system like you'd find in Harry Potter, a local witch hunter would like to have a word with you. In essence, while a lot of fantasy worlds encourage you to dream about living in them, Warhammer Fantasy makes you thankful you're not. You could find yourself in one of these places, but you'd be far from the hero. Instead, you'd be either a Bretonian peasant breaking your back to pay 90% of your produce to your lord, a merchant traveling on a ship before being raided and enslaved by dark elves who think you look better in chains and screaming, or just find yourself bereft of a head after a drunken brawl in a tavern gone south. It's a world where no one is safe, not even the strongest, and the only thing that is certain is that things are always going to get a lot worse. If there's one thing you need to know about Warhammer Fantasy, it's that history doesn't get better with time. It just finds new and more creative ways to be awful. Every great civilization eventually collapses, usually in fire, war, or some kind of magical catastrophe, and those left behind just try their best to scrape by before the next disaster. It's a history where the only constant is suffering, and any time someone gets a little too powerful, the universe decides, actually, no.
The mysteries of the Chaos Wastes. What do you think created them?
Frogs. Yeah, I heard it was frogs. Really big frogs.
Long before humans were even relevant, the Old Ones arrived en masse, a mysterious, godlike race of massive space frogs with unfathomable intelligence, reality-breaking magic, and an unhealthy obsession with planetary terraforming. These celestial amphibians did things like create entire races to serve them, shift continents like they were playing SimCity, and also move the planet closer to the sun. They created the Seraphon, better known as the Lizardmen. Imagine the Aztecs. Now imagine they're lizardmen. Now imagine them riding dinosaurs. And you've got the Lizardmen. The Old Ones also created the Elves, the Dwarves, Ogres, and of course, humanity. The Lizardmen acted as the helper and enforcer of the Old Ones, exterminating the other races the Old Ones deemed unfit to live. Except, of course, the Orcs, because no one can get rid of the greenskins. It was all going great, but since this is Warhammer, chaos comes flying in with a steel chair to flatten the planet down. Then came the Warp Gates disaster, because of course the Old Ones decided to set up interdimensional gateways at the poles of the world, and of course those gateways eventually broke. When they collapsed, they ripped open the direct path to the realm of chaos, flooding the worlds with demonic horrors and warping reality itself. The Old Ones, they peaced out, went to get milk probably. The Lizardmen, scrambling to clean up the mess. The planet, doomed. With chaos flooding the world, the Lizardmen fought a desperate war to hold back the madness, but couldn't do it alone. That's where the Elves came in. Led by their greatest mage, Kalidor Dragon Tamer, the Elves created the Great Vortex, a magical whirlpool that sucked up excess chaos energy and prevented the world from turning into a demon rave party. With the world somewhat stable, civilizations rose. The Elves of Ulthuan became the dominant magical power, ruling an empire of grace, arrogance, and horrifically bad political decisions. Meanwhile, the Dwarves built massive underground fortresses, surviving through sheer stubbornness, copious amount of beer, and the ability to hold grudges longer than any living being should. The two civilizations became allies, until, inevitably, they found a reason to hate each other. The War of the Beard, or the War of Vengeance as the dwarves insist on calling it because they refuse to admit how ridiculous it was one of the pettiest, most drawn-out conflicts in Warhammer history. It was an epic, centuries-long grudge match between the High Elves and the Dwarves, fought over misunderstandings, pride, and as the name suggests, facial hair. It all started when the Phoenix King of the High Elves, Belshazzar the Navigator, maintained friendly relations with the Dwarves. All was relatively peaceful, until Malekith, the ultimate mama's boy and prince of petty vengeance, decided to ruin everything. The Dark Elves had just lost the civil war against the High Elves, and were in full, "if we can't have Ulthuan, let's ruin it for everyone else" mode. Malekith knew the dwarves took beards more seriously than full-scale invasions, so he had his agents ambush and slaughter some dwarven trade caravans, looting their goods, killing the merchants, and most importantly, shaving their beards before dumping their corpses where the dwarves would find them. Naturally, the dwarves assumed the High Elves were responsible because at this point, the dwarves didn't know that the elves were sundered into different peoples. This was written down in the Damas Kron, the Great Book of Grudges, essentially the ultimate list of people the dwarves will never, ever forgive. And even with thousands of years of meticulously recorded grudges, it still barely holds a candle to the diary of an average teenage girl. By this point, Gotrek Starbreaker, the High King of the Dwarves, was not amused. In typical dwarf fashion, he demanded an apology and reparations in gold from the newly crowned Phoenix King, Kalidor II, because nothing soothes a dwarf's rage like gold and groveling. Now at this point, Kalidor had many options. He could have investigated, maybe blamed the Dark Elves, or paid the dwarves a small sum just to shut them up. Instead, because of his impressive diplomatic skills that rivaled that of a drug addict, he did something monumentally stupid. He mocked the dwarves. How? By shaving the beard of the dwarf envoy he sent back to Karazakarak. Not only that, he had the poor guy's eyebrows removed too, just to hammer home the insult, leaving his kin shocked as their brother returned looking like a freshly hatched egg. The dwarves, already furious, went absolutely ballistic. That's it. Cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war. Total war. And so began the War of the Beard, a devastating, drawn-out, and utterly unnecessary conflict between two of the most stubborn civilizations in Warhammer. It lasted several centuries, with battles so bitter that entire elven cities were razed, and dwarfholds collapsed under the strain of endless fighting. The elves, already dealing with their own internal civil war aftermath, couldn't afford a full-scale conflict, but they fought anyway, because petty grudges transcend reason. The war finally ended when Gotrek Starbreaker personally slew Calador II in single combat. Now in any normal story, this would be the moment where everyone realizes, oh wow, we really went overboard with this war. Maybe we should negotiate for peace. Nope, the dwarves still held a grudge because while they had won militarily, they never received a formal apology from the elves. Meanwhile, the High Elves, despite suffering catastrophic losses, never fully forgave the dwarves for burning their colonies on the mainland. And so the grudge remains open to this day, because if there's one thing you can count on in Warhammer Fantasy, it's that dwarves never let anything go, and elves never admit when they were wrong. Humanity. Starting from simple hunter-gatherer societies, we somehow managed to claw our way up the evolutionary ladder to the point where we could build cities, fight wars over absolutely everything, and invent bureaucracy, because nothing says progress like paperwork. As humanity spread across the old world, different tribes and cultures emerge, each with its own spin on how to complicate life. But there's one civilization that stands out as the first truly grand human achievement, Nehekhara.
انت يا ريس هسه انت اطلع انا اخرس لا يا انت شاكر يا اخوان
Nehekhara was humanity's first great civilization, a testament to what we can accomplish when we focus all our energy on building massive tombs instead of inventing, say, plumbing. While other societies were busy figuring out how to make life easier, the Nehekharans were busy figuring out how to make death as complicated and expensive as possible. At its peak, Nehekhara was a marvel. Cities like Khemri, Numas, and Zandri were bustling metropolises filled with markets, grand temples, and, if you were really lucky, a newly constructed mausoleum the size of a small mountain. The people of Nehekhara believed that life was merely a temporary inconvenience before the real party, eternity. And nothing says, I am ready for eternity, quite like being buried with a golden chariot, a dozen embalmed servants, and an entire banquet table's worth of dried food. But such greatness did not simply emerge from the sands. No, it was forged, or rather, brutally imposed by Setra the Imperishable, a man whose sheer force of will shaped history, and whose ego might still be detectable from orbit. As a side note, his full list of titles canonically requires hours to read out, and Setra gets very, very upset when his heralds don't read it out properly. Setra looked at a land of squabbling city-states and thought, I can fix this, before proceeding to fix it through sheer determination and, presumably, a lot of executions. He unified Nehekhara into a single, mighty empire, bringing civilization, order, and history's first recorded case of extreme megalomania. Setra didn't mess around with dark magic. That was for lesser rulers. No, Setra believed in doing things the proper way. He sought immortality through divine favor, grand monuments, and sheer willpower. To this end, he established the mortuary cult, whose sole purpose was to find a way to immortality so that Setra can rule his kingdom for all eternity. But unsurprisingly, they failed to find a way to accomplish this task, at most only being able to prolong their lords' lives to a couple of centuries. Setra was understandably furious, but his priests promised to find a way eventually, so Setra was entombed along with all his retinues, an army in his Great Pyramid, so that one day the priests can finally resurrect him in a new golden body. But this mortuary cult would indirectly lead the whole of Nehekhara to complete ruin.
I can't remember when I've had a more pleasant day.
In that dread desert, beneath the moon's pale gaze, dead men walk. They haunt the shifting dunes of the breathless, windless night, brandish weapons of bronze in mocking challenge and bitter resentment of the life they no longer possess. And sometimes, in ghastly dry voices, like the rustling of sun-baked reeds, they whisper the one word they remember from life, the name of the one who cursed them to their existence. More than death, but less than life. They whisper the name. Nagash. Now you may be wondering, why the hell does this bald guy get a whole section all to himself? Well, my dear viewer, there are several reasons for that. One, he is extremely integral to Nehekhara's story and the Warhammer Fantasy world as a whole. Second, literally just look at my channel name and who is that on my channel profile. Third, and the most important, such is the power of Nagash. Before he was the world's biggest skeleton and Warhammer's original being an asshole feels good villain, Nagash was just an angry, brooding prince / Grand Hierophant in Khemri, jealous of his younger brother and deeply annoyed that he wasn't the one set to inherit the throne. In a normal society, he might have coped by writing bad poetry or sulking in a library. Unfortunately, this was Nehekhara, where ambition and megalomania were practically national pastimes. So instead of growing out of his jealousy, Nagash dove headfirst into the dark arts, killed his entire family, and decided to live forever out of sheer spite. Nagash was born as the first son of King Ketep of Khemri, but as tradition in Nehekhara, the firstborn son was given to Nehekhara's mortuary cult to become a priest, a noble and sacred duty. Nagash, naturally, saw this as an excellent opportunity to commit unspeakable crimes against nature. While his younger brother got to be king, Nagash got to start performing rituals and building tombs, a job he found unbelievably boring. But while most people would just grit their teeth and get through it, Nagash spent his time quietly plotting the downfall of everything his family had ever built. He became even more obsessed with power and ruling after a battle where he was given temporary command and had his name scraped from the records as just being a great general. Nehekhara's rulers died and passed on their kingdoms to lesser men over and over again. Why should death ever be allowed to take what was his? Why should kings die and let their idiot sons undo their greatness? And more importantly, why should he have to serve a little brother he could probably snap in half? So, like any rational man who just wanted job security, Nagash entombed his brother alive, seized the throne, and made himself king. If you think Nagash might have hesitated after murdering his own family and stealing the throne, let me introduce you to a core aspect of his personality. Nagash is the kind of person who, upon committing his first war crime, immediately starts planning 100 more. To cement his rule, Nagash decided he needed an army that could never die, a kingdom that would never fall, and a civilization where literally nobody but him mattered. But where was he going to learn the art to accomplish his goals? Surely no one in Nehekhara practiced such things. Oh wait, he had prisoners. A group of shipwrecked dark elves from Nagaroth was in the custody of the Nehekharans, ready to be sacrificed to their not Egyptian gods. Nagash, ever the opportunist, took one look at these sinister knife-ears and immediately decided that they were useful. Unlike most Nehekharans who would have just sacrificed them to their gods, Nagash tortured them until they agreed to teach him their ways. Now, the Dark Elves were many things: cruel, treacherous, obsessed with murder, but they were also pragmatic. They figured, fine, we'll teach this ambitious upstart some magic, pretending he's a quick learner, and then escape when we get the chance. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Nagash didn't just learn their magic, he mastered it. He took the Dark Elves' knowledge of sorcery, twisted it into something even worse, and then, because he could never just stop at normal levels of evil, expanded upon it, creating something even darker. Vadruki quickly realized with growing horror that they had accidentally created a monster. When they finally tried to make their escape, Nagash caught them. But instead of simply executing them, he did something far worse. If you want to leave, prove you're stronger than me. The Dark Elves, masters of dark magic, centuries of experience, absolute confidence, immediately accepted. After all, this was just a human, right? They lost horribly. What followed was one of the most humiliating defeats in Druki history. Their own magic, their own knowledge, all turned against him. Nagash, now a one-man magical apocalypse, obliterated them in a duel so one-sided that even Cain himself probably facepalmed. And with that, he had officially become the first true necromancer. From that day forward, Nagash wasn't just a tyrant, he was something else entirely. A walking, talking abomination against nature, the single worst thing to ever happen to Nehekhara and the world at large, and a permanent stain on the Dark Elves' historical record. Having successfully invented the worst thing ever, Nagash decided it was time to build a monument to himself. Now, you may recall that Nehekhara was already obsessed with monumental architecture. Nagash took one look at the vast necropolises and the Grand Pyramid of Setera, whose pyramid no one dared to surpass, and thought, pathetic. Make it bigger, make it black, make it cursed. And so, with a level of hubris that would make even the Chaos Gods blink, Nagash commissioned the Black Pyramid, a structure so vast, so malevolent, and so utterly unnecessary that it required a workforce of thousands of slaves and took 50 years of painstaking construction to finish. The Black Pyramid was essentially the world's first full-scale supervillain lair, a swirling vortex of dark magic so saturated with pure, concentrated evil that it permanently tainted the land around it. It was the first structure built specifically to absorb and store dark magic, ensuring that Nagash would have an endless supply of power to fuel his ever-expanding plans for world domination. At this point, Nehekhara collectively realized that this king was a problem. The other city-states, which had tolerated his nonsense up until now, finally joined forces in open rebellion. Even by Nehekharan standards, he had gone too far. So they attacked Kembri, beat his army into the sand, and forced him to flee for his life. But as we all know, Nagash is a problem that never truly goes away. Exiled to the north, Nagash eventually stumbled upon some strange substance known as warpstone. Basically uranium mixed with crack cocaine, mixed with eldritch magic. Naturally, instead of fearing it, he immediately began shoving it into his mouth like a starving rat. Surprisingly, he discovered that it boosted his power to tremendous levels. As he wandered the desert for years upon years, delirious and without much sense of direction, he stumbled upon an interesting sight, Cripple Peak, a mountain that was the crash site of a gigantic warpstone meteor. Naturally, Nagash wanted this place all for himself, so he took it and built upon it his grand fortress of Nagashizar, glory of Nagash in Nehekharan, very humble, he knows. Over the next several centuries, Nagash built an empire of undeath, mastered even darker arts, and raised an army that would never age, never tire, and never disobey him. Because, they were dead. But during that time, he also encountered a peculiar race of drug-addicted, roided-up, endless ratmen. The Skaven have come to play. And by play, I mean take Warpstone and ruin Nagash's day along the way. This whole shenanigan led to war. 100 years of war, to be exact. A war that saw all of Skavendom unite, kind of, to take on Warhammer Skeletor and his Bone Mafia. The war was a hilarious stalemate of both sides going, "Oh, this time for sure," sending endless troops against each other. The Skavens were endless, breeding quicker than the Victorian family, relentlessly battering against Nagash's forces. But Nagash was no slouch. He was the necromancer, the first necromancer, the great necromancer. So obviously he just keeps raising the Skavens dead into his army. And so passed 100 years of war of back and forth between the two biggest factions of pricks in Warhammer history, until finally they settled on a truce, and Nagash can return to bigger and better things, reconquering Nehekhara. He returned to Nehekhara to finish what he started, where he was promptly beaten again, this time by the last great mortal king of Nehekhara, Alcadizar the Conqueror. But being a sore loser, Nagash then destroyed much of Nehekhara and its population, tainting the land even further, along with the great river Vitae, which henceforth was known as the River Mortis. Why an Egyptian-inspired land with the Nile coursing through it had said river using a Latin name is only something GW's writers, in their infinite wisdom, can know. With much of the life in Nehekhara destroyed, no one could stop Nagash and his armies from marching into Kemri, capturing and imprisoning the weakened Alcadizar, and placing himself as king of Kemri once again. But Nagash had more ambitions than just Nehekhara, and so he returns to Nagashizar. The result? The Great Ritual. In an act of pure, unfiltered Saturday morning cartoon-level villainy, Nagash cast a spell so vast, so apocalyptic, that it killed everyone left in Nehekhara. His magic ripped the souls from the living, withered crops, drained rivers, and left the land a desolate wasteland. He had, quite literally, turned an entire empire into one massive haunted house. He then proceeded to raise the dead, both recent and ancient, under his control. But before he could enjoy his new undead utopia, Alcadizar, the last king of Kemri, was literally broken out by the damned Skaven. They gave him a blade made of potent warpstone, so potent in fact it killed the rats holding it after a day or two, and took many rats to carry from Skavenblight to Nagashizar. Alcadizar, probably half mad after torture and seeing his beloved realm destroyed, only had one thing in mind. He went to Nagash, who was spent after enacting the ritual, and slew him with the Fellblade, killing him once and for all.
I am the comet! I burn the impure!
Before the coming of Sigmar, there was no empire, only chaos. The lands that would one day become the greatest nation of men were nothing more than a scattered collection of warring tribes, each convinced that the best way to ensure their survival was to repeatedly bludgeon their neighbors into submission. These were not noble kingdoms or grand civilizations. They were violent, squabbling warbands constantly at each other's throats over land, honor, and occasionally just because someone looked at someone else the wrong way. The world was a dangerous place. Green-skinned hordes poured through the mountains in endless waves. Beastmen lurked in the forest, and the ever-present threat of chaos loomed over all. Humanity was divided, weak, and on the verge of being swept aside by the countless horrors that stalked the land. Had things continued this way, there would be no empire, no golden age for men, only extinction. But fate had other plans. In the time before time, orcs roamed the land. All was darkness. It was a time of woes. It was a time of doom. It was a time of wolves. Mankind was prey. They looked to the sky, cried to the gods, "Deliver us!" And the gods answered. Into the darkness came a light a torch of the gods, a dragon with two tails, flying in the sky by night. One looked to another. What can the sign mean? Orcs grew fearful, wolves slunk to their lairs. And by gods answered, what he really meant was that a kid was born with main character energy. From the warlike Unberogen tribe, in the shadow of the mountains, a child was born, Sigmar. From the moment he entered the world, it was clear he was different. Stronger, sharper, and greater in stature than any other, he grew into a warrior of unmatched skill and an orator of unshakable conviction. Where others saw only the grim fate of their people, Sigmar saw a future, a land united, an empire forged, a people rising above their own self-destructive squabbles. Among the Unberogans, a child was born, a chief's son, destined for greatness. And the gods decreed that his name shall be Sigmar, for one whose coming was foretold by the signs of the gods. And this Sigmar, while yet a youth, withstood goblin and orc, while others fled, taking up his father's axe, defending his hearth and home. Fear not, mother, sister, be not afraid. This house is not for burning, nor this village, not while the hand of a man can hold the shaft of an axe. Translation: Sigmar was built different. While most children spend their youth playing, Sigmar spent his hacking apart goblins. When an orc raid came upon his village, others fled. Sigmar, he picked up an axe, put on his best "Gods, I hate greenskins," and got to work. No one had to tell him to be a warrior. He simply was one. And so, he set out to do what no other had ever dared: unite the tribes of men into a single, indomitable force. Sigmar's path was not an easy one. The tribes were proud, stubborn, and deeply committed to the fine tradition of stabbing each other over minor disputes. Some he brought to his side through diplomacy, others by strength of arms, and a few through what scholars have politely referred to as aggressive negotiations, which in less refined terms means he beat their chieftains into the dirt and told them to get in line. Yet Sigmar was far more than a mere conqueror. He was a unifier. He sought not domination for its own sake, but the forging of a united front against the encroaching darkness. After all, nothing rallies disparate tribes quite like the impending doom of an endless horde of orcs and goblins, nature's own unsightly green plague. It was during these turbulent times that Sigmar performed one of his first great deeds. While leading his warriors into battle against the marauding greenskins, he discovered that a band of dwarves had been captured by the orcish menace. Among them was High King Kurgan Ironbeard, leader of the dwarves, who had been ambushed by an overwhelming orcish force. Sigmar led his warriors into the fray, smashing through the orcs with such force that even the dwarves, no strangers to battle, were taken aback. Kurgan, recognizing the young warrior's strength and potential, quickly threw him a mighty warhammer, Gal Maraz, the Splitter of Skulls. A weapon like no other, this warhammer was a masterwork of dwarven craftsmanship, imbued with the might to crush bone, shatter steel, and most importantly, make a very convincing argument when words failed. It was the hammer that would define Sigmar, a weapon so iconic that it would one day become the symbol of an entire civilization, and the logo of an overpriced miniature company. With Gal Maraz in hand, Sigmar and his men slaughtered the remaining orcs and saved the dwarves and their High King. In a move that would change the fates of the two people, and the world as a whole, High King Kurgan Ironbeard gave the warhammer to Sigmar as a gift and symbol of eternal friendship between the dwarves and men. With each passing year, Sigmar brought more tribes under his banner, forging alliances where others had only known war. But unification was not enough. He had to prove that the Empire could stand against the horrors of the world. That test came at Blackfire Pass. The orcs in their endless hunger for destruction had gathered a horde the likes of which had never been seen before. Tens of thousands of greenskins surged forward, seeking to sweep across the land in a tide of destruction. If they were not stopped here, now, then all of Sigmar's work would be undone before it had even begun. And so on that fateful day, the fate of mankind hung in the balance. Sigmar stood at the front lines, not as a king in a palace, but as a warrior among his people. With his warhammer in hand, he led the charge, smashing through the Orcish ranks like an avatar of divine wrath. The battle raged, blood soaked the earth, and when the dust settled, it was not the greenskins who remained standing. Mankind had won. The victory at Blackfire Pass was more than just a battle. It was a declaration. No longer were the tribes of men scattered and weak. No longer would they be prey to the horrors of the world. An empire had been forged in blood and steel, and its ruler stood before them. Sigmar Heldenhammer, the Emperor. For decades, Sigmar ruled wisely, laying the foundations of the greatest civilization the world had ever seen. He built cities, established laws, and most importantly, gave humanity a purpose beyond mere survival. The dwarves remained staunch allies, their craftsmen helping to raise mighty fortresses and forging powerful weapons, their wisdom aiding in the shaping of a fledgling empire. But no man, not even Sigmar, could rule forever. One day, without warning, he departed from the empire, riding eastward into the unknown. His destination, his purpose, none can say for certain. Some believe he sought enlightenment, others that he had unfinished business with the gods. Many claim that he had ascended, becoming one with the divine, watching over the empire from beyond mortal comprehension. What is known is this: he never returned. But his legacy remains. His hammer, his law, his empire. These endure. And as long as men raise swords in his name, Sigmar will never truly be gone. And with that, we conclude this little journey through the history of Warhammer Fantasy. At least up to the point where it was still good. I will not be covering the end times, partly because it depresses me, and partly because this video is already 40 minutes long. If you really want to see the setting get thrown into a meat grinder for the sake of selling a new product line, there are plenty of sources that will detail that tragedy for you. I, however, prefer to keep my sanity. For now, at least. Now, before we part ways, let's address the inevitable question: why Warhammer Fantasy and not 40k? I'm not here to say that 40k is bad, only that fantasy is better. Both settings are rich, detailed, and compelling in their own ways, but while 40k is grand, exaggerated satire of authoritarianism and the horrors of endless war, Warhammer Fantasy is an actual world. A world that lives, that changes, that holds on to the weight of its history. It is not just a backdrop for war, it is a setting where nations rise and fall, where individuals can shape the fate of empires, where history matters, where the story goes forward. Warhammer Fantasy came first. Many of 40k's greatest ideas, they were borrowed, repurposed, translated into space. The Empire became the Imperium. Although, let's be honest, the Imperium is basically just a space Skavens. The Elves became the Eldar. The Orcs, well, they just got guns. Chaos, the exact same gods. And while 40k's scale is undeniably massive, its stories often feel static, trapped in an endless cycle of war, doomed to repeat the same themes forever. Warhammer Fantasy, on the other hand, had room to breathe, to develop, to tell stories that weren't just about war, but ambition, betrayal, heroism, survival. But alas, Warhammer Fantasy was left to die in the gutter, while Games Workshop gave the GOG 40,000 trademark to the Imperium's bloated, rotting, overhyped phallus, polishing that corpse Emperor's shaft like their shareholders depended on it. Which, to be fair, it does. On a more civilized note, I want to sincerely thank you for watching this far. If you've made it to the end, either you are truly interested in this setting, or you simply had nothing better to do for the past 40 minutes. Either way, I appreciate you. Every piece of artwork, or at least most, as I may miss some, used in this video has been catalogued, time-stamped, and credited in a spreadsheet linked in the description below. It may be excessive, I know, but I am paranoid and the spreadsheet lessens it slightly. If you've enjoyed this, feel free to share it, leave a like, drop a comment below, and perhaps even subscribe, so you'll be promptly informed when the next questionably assembled piece of content graces your screen. Once again, thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, Sigmar protects, but in the end, Nagash owns your soul.